Get started in about 1 minute. All right, so just so you know, Kathleen, I'm not seeing the chat. Oh, here we go. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, happy Earth Day. My name is Timothy Parent and I am the president and founder trustee of Harvard Alumni for Fashion, Luxury, and Retail. And I'll also be teaching this Fashion Revolution Week classroom today on regenerating local communities, economies, and environments. And I want to make sure that this is a process where we learn together. So please feel free throughout the conversation to ask questions through the chat. So before we get into any of the content, I do want, Kathleen, can you still hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
It says I've been signed out, but I guess we're still on, so.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. And just so everyone knows, we are recording this. Kathleen will touch on that in a second, but before we get to that, I do want to make a land acknowledgement. So as I mentioned, my name is Timothy Parent, and I'm hosting this event from the occupied territory of the Duwamish, better known as Seattle. So I want to acknowledge the unceded land that I'm currently occupying in order to help decolonize our gathering spaces, recognize Indigenous stewardship of the land, air, and water we claim as our own, and to combat the invisibility and erasure of Indigenous peoples. So I would invite you all to find out whose land you are occupying by visiting native-land.ca and to incorporate a land acknowledgement whenever you're speaking to a group. So if you know whose territory you are currently occupying, please feel free to share it in the chat. And if you're not occupying anyone's land, that's awesome. Please also share that in the chat. And I just wanted to make that land acknowledgement because we have to recognize that all wealth comes from the earth, all wealth comes from nature. And so that's fundamental to our conversation today. So Kathleen, if you wanted to introduce yourself and Fashion Revolution Week.
Hi, Timothy. Thanks so much for joining together with this event today. And we at Fashion Revolution USA are so excited to be here. I also want to give some land acknowledgement to where I am sitting today in Milford, Massachusetts, and the traditional territory of the Nipmuc Nation tribe. I honor the lands and waters that they have stewarded here for time immemorial. We, as Fashion Revolution, are still learning and pushing ourselves to do better to support Indigenous communities. We are continuing our journey here today and encourage you all to learn about the importance of land acknowledgement, as Timothy had already mentioned. So I hope you visit the chat room and just see the link for native-land.ca. And this week is Fashion Revolution Week. So we are at Thursday, which is also Earth Day. It's a very celebratory day today. So it's a great day to be together with Timothy. And we're looking at a lot of programming still to come. So we have more programming this evening. And Saturday and Sunday, we have a big event with Made Incubator, also here in Boston, even though Timothy's on the West Coast and I'm on the East Coast. And I will put those event page in the chat room. But thank you again, Timothy, for this honor of sharing this space with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much to Fashion Revolution Week for all of their action in this sector, and also to everyone who contributed to this event. So you're going to hear from 3 different contributors, but let's jump right in with definitions. I think it's really, or actually, sorry, I want to introduce myself very briefly. So as I mentioned, my name is Timothy. I'm on the West Coast and from here originally, but I went to Florida to train for swimming. I was a very serious swimmer, and I have this inherent connection to the water, and I was training for the Olympics. I didn't make it, but it helped me get into school. So I ended up studying East Asian studies at Harvard. I'm half Korean, and I always was very interested in my Asian side. So I started a charity fashion show there called Project East, where we worked with student designers and established designers of Asian heritage. And then I wrote my thesis on the difference between clothing, fashion, and style, and how these concepts manifested in China. I spent 10 years in China doing field research on Chinese consumers, taking street style photographs. So I approached fashion from a very sociological and anthropological lens. And I think it's a really great lens to understand different phenomenon. So whether we're talking about social, racial, environmental, or economic justice, fashion is related to all of these things. And that's really what Harvard Alumni for Fashion, Luxury, and Retail is about, the intersection of those three industries with social, racial, environmental, and economic justice. And social also includes things like gender justice, as you know, many of you, I'm sure, are well aware. So the group was founded for three purposes: for educating, networking, and charity. And so, you know, we want to make sure that education is open and accessible to everyone. And so I wanted to thank everyone in the audience here today for taking that step in educating yourself on these issues. So I also want to acknowledge that we're all still going through the pandemic, and we've all had to wear masks for a long time. That's something I had to do in China for 10 years. I didn't have access to clean air. It's our #1 consumable. And you know, not only carbon emissions from the manufacturing of clothing is affecting our air, but also microplastics. So it's really important that we protect our air, we protect our land and our water. And Harvard and fashion certainly affects all of those. Unfortunately, Harvard doesn't do a lot of research in those areas, but we're working to change that. So just one quick note from Kathleen, because the event is being recorded.
Just thank you. So this event you're about to attend will be recorded and or live streamed and saved to be viewed on our Fashion Revolution channels and also within the Harvard alumni community. So by joining this event, you consent to Fashion Revolution and our partners broadcasting photographs and video recordings of you and using photographs and or images of you made from the recording of the live stream. The video and images will be used for non-commercial purposes in any media, including print and digital. If you do not wish to be featured, please mute your microphone and turn off your camera, or if you would prefer, which we really hope you don't do, is exit the event. Thank you very much again for being here, and let's go forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. So just a quick note on, you know, experiencing pollution, like me having this lived experience, whether or not it's happening to you, please do take action. So we'll be focused on action today as well. So before we jump into the meat of the conversation, I really wanted to talk about definitions. I studied East Asian studies, and Confucianism is huge on labels and names and how we define things. So I wanted to talk about revolution because it's Fashion Revolution Week. So in the dictionary, it says an overthrow or repudiation and the thorough replacement of an established government or political system by the people governed. Obviously, this is not like a political system. It is politicized in some ways, but the sociological perspective is a little bit better. The definitions is a little bit better. It's a radical and pervasive change in society and the social structure, especially one made suddenly and often accompanied by violence. And when I looked this up, I thought it was so interesting because we're talking about revolution through violence, but we're actually revolting against violence. So this fashion revolution is about abolishing violence and getting rid of it within the fashion system. And a lot of people that work in this system don't want to talk about violence, which is mainly committed against women, children, poor people, and people of color. So we definitely need to address these issues, even if they're not happening in your own backyard and even if you can't see it, right? So regeneration offers us some solutions for this. Regenerative as a verb, it means to affect a complete moral reform in. So we're talking about the morality of a system. And I think that's, another intersection of fashion and morality that maybe we don't focus on as much, but there are moral imperatives, right, beyond the incentive of profit that we need to address as a society. Another, it could also be defined as to come into existence or be formed again, be reconstituted or made over in a better form. So we're going to have some better definitions from Amy Hall, who will be our first video that we're going to go through. So we'll talk a little bit, obviously, more about regenerative beyond a dictionary definition. But I did want to talk about sustainability, this term sustainable. It really means a lot. It means everything. So it also kind of means nothing at all. It gets thrown around a lot. It's a very loaded term. It's similar to media, where it has so many meanings, it's kind of hard to understand. So I'd really urge everyone who's attending today to focus on using more specific terms, whether it's circular or regenerative. So to me, sustainable just means it's kind of a low bar, and it just means you can continue doing what you're doing for forever. It can be sustained, right? When we talk about circularity, we're talking about materials circulating for forever and there's no waste, right? Regenerative practices are net positive, and they, sort of add more than they take out. So again, regenerative is about systems design. We're not just talking about product design or even a brand, it's an entire system. And so we need a very holistic approach. When we're trying to consider if a brand or a product is regenerative, it has to be considered holistically. So as I mentioned, it's not just about a single brand or a single person or a single consumer or a single product. We have collective ownership over the regenerative model, and it's something that's being built now. So it's very malleable and something that everybody here can contribute to. We also, I wanted to talk about democratic fashion. I think that this is something that Mitchell Henderson talks about in his clip. I think we're thinking about democratic fashion completely in the wrong way. It doesn't mean cheap clothes to make it accessible. It's talking about accessible in other terms, like if this clothing really resonates with you, if it fits a certain body type, if it's made for people with sensory issues, if it's made accessible to like people who need and actually use it. We don't need to make clothing ubiquitous and cheap for everyone. But that's also not to say that that this movement is only to regenerate the fast fashion industry. We're looking at the fashion industry as a whole, because the luxury industry is still complicit in a lot of the violence and the atrocities and inequities that we have within the fashion system. And the last thing I'd like to touch on is value. So we always think about economic value, but I think when we talk about value, we need to think about the environmental cost of a product and the human cost of a product. And so you should always combine value with your values. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first clip. So as everyone knows, we're talking about local communities, economies, and environments. So we're going to start off with economies. And so Amy Hall is the founder and president of Impactorum, who's an expert in regenerative business, sustainable, ethical, and circular apparel, and she's the host of the Impact Matters webcast. So she's going to share a little bit more with us on specifically regenerative economies. Let me see, sorry.
Hey everyone, I'm here to talk about local regenerative economies. It sounds like a mouthful, but it's really simple. In a conventional economy, which is how most countries and businesses operate in today's world, Wealth and progress are determined by financial gains. The more money a business makes, the more successful, and therefore the more valuable it is. The higher the gross domestic product, or the financial value of goods and services produced in a year, the richer the country. A regenerative economy is one that looks at wealth as more than financial. It includes spiritual, physical, and emotional well-being. It strives for universal abundance and balance, where all things will thrive in harmony. It's participatory, whereby everyone has a purpose and a role. It's resilient and adaptable, and it's additive, which means it strives for a net positive footprint. Another word for regenerative is restorative, and that's how I like to think about regenerative business. Is our business operating in a way that actually regenerates or generates more good than bad? Does it turn waste into new product? Does it pay people a living wage so that they can thrive? Does it generate more renewable energy than it can use? These are examples of regenerative business practices. It's moving from the current model of doing less bad to leaving this planet and her people healthier, happier, and more harmonious than when the business started. I have a few examples of local regenerative apparel businesses from around the world and of all different sizes. The first one is Liberty and Justice, based in Liberia, Africa, which hires local women at the bottom of the pyramid to make clothing for the Western market and school uniforms for their own communities. The women own 49% of the company, so there's wealth sharing in the company. They receive free health care, they receive literacy classes, and 100% of their savings are matched. This is a business that helps all of its stakeholders to thrive while also being financially viable. Cytex in Vietnam is one of the largest denim suppliers in the world. It's also a certified B Corporation, which means it's been recognized for its people, planet, and profit model. It has rigorous environmental initiatives, such as recycling 98% of their water. It upcycles the denim waste into building bricks. It's way cool. It air dries their jeans and uses solar energy to power their facilities. It also involves employees in every facet of innovation. And it has installed hydroponic and clean farming systems at their facilities to provide healthy food for the employees. And Reformation in California has been building a regenerative business from the start by paying all of its team members, corporate and supply chain, a living wage. By addressing every aspect of its impact, from office building to product to manufacturing, which is, by the way, predominantly in the US, in its commitments and actions. Also a certified B Corporation, Reformation is an excellent example of how a business can achieve shared prosperity for people and planet. For me, the bottom line in regenerative business is looking beyond the financial returns and focusing also on the net positive impact across the entire value chain. So how do you know if you're actually generating a net positive impact? My favorite tool is the Future Fit Benchmark, which guides businesses of any size and industry to actively prepare for a flourishing future society. The tool allows you to measure your actual impact, as well as determine where you need to put more focus. So check out futurebusiness.org. The Body Shop is one company that has adopted this tool. Another excellent resource is B Lab, which has created the B Corporation certification that I mentioned earlier. There are almost 4,000 certified B Corporations in the world today, including Patagonia, Eileen Fisher, Athleta, and Liberty and Justice, and Reformation. You can learn more at bcorporation.net. Keep in mind that both of these resources are aligned around the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which makes them much more accessible and universally adoptable. So as you set up your apparel business, think about all the different ways you are contributing to a future where all life thrives on Earth. That, to me, is regenerative business.
So was everybody able to hear that okay? All right, I'm getting some nods, but just so Bailey and anyone else in the chat, if you couldn't hear it quickly, or if you couldn't hear it clearly, I can go through it quickly. But basically, Amy was talking about, the conventional economy looking primarily at wealth and progress through the lens of financial gains, right? So the higher GDP, the richer the country. But another way to look at GDP is just like how much stuff you produce, right? Like how much do you make? And I know that that's not everything is physically made, but it's very, it's not a very good indicator or way to measure well-being. It's really measuring specifically the wealth of a country, but it has nothing really to do with well-being, especially as we've seen in the recovery of the coronavirus pandemic. Has been kind of a K-shaped recovery where the people that already had, that were doing okay are doing much better, and the people that were not doing well are doing much worse. So we definitely need new metrics. So the regenerative economy looks at wealth and progress as something more than financial. We look at spiritual, physical, emotional, and mental well-being. And as I mentioned earlier, all wealth comes from the earth. So it definitely needs to, so we need to consider environmental impacts, right? And that environmental cost. So it's additive, we'll have a net positive footprint. We can have the conversation later about whether or not there can actually be something as climate positive t-shirt or climate positive apparel. But we're working to generate more good than bad. So regenerative can also be thought as restorative because of what we've done to the earth and communities. We need to start restoring them before we get into the new paradigm shift where we coexist harmoniously with nature. So one of the really interesting business models, I think, is liberty and justice based in Liberia. And Amy mentioned that 49% of the company is owned by local women, specifically, as she mentioned, at the bottom of the pyramid, just being the most socioeconomically disadvantaged. So basically empowering the exploited. So currently we exploit a certain class of people, and in the regenerative model, we can empower them. And it's not just charity. It's not a Tom's model of like, oh, we buy a shoe and then we're going to give you a shoe. When you consider on paper, it looks really good, but when you consider it from a holistic perspective, as all regenerative systems should be, it actually was really bad. That model is really bad for local shoe manufacturers, because how can you compete with a product that costs nothing, right? So we don't need saviorism, but we do need people to empower those communities that were previously exploited. So she talked a little bit about brands. Do we need another brand? Absolutely not. Do we need another regenerative brand? Maybe. It really depends on what you're regenerating. But the point is not for everybody to go and create their own brand. But if there are brand owners here and founders, then thank you for being here and considering this in your business model. So to recap, we're looking at more than GDP and wealth. We're looking at natural capital and human capital, so investments into the environment itself and investments into people. We're looking at inserting more into the value chain than we're extracting. So extractive systems are based on colonialism and imperialism, where there is no respect for land or local communities or local resources. You don't really care about whether you're polluting that system because it's not your environment that you're living in. So we definitely need to move away from extractive systems. We also need to consider scale. And so I think that this is probably like a very dirty sounding concept to a strict capitalist, but most likely will be limits on the scale of a regenerative business. Regenerative models need to be rolled out at a large scale, but if you're talking about the scale of your business, maybe there are limitations, and that's okay with how big it gets, right? So you can create more profits in other ways than just trying to create more products. You know, you can have higher margins and focus on higher quality. And so when we talk about efficiencies of scale, it's actually a really gross misnomer. We're just saying that we're producing a lot of stuff that nobody ends up buying. So really look at handcraft. Buying handcraft is a really great way to support local communities and environments if they're done in an environmentally friendly way. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on is about IP and collective ownership. So we're going to hear a little bit about this in our next video from Gisele Jimenez. But IP is not really well protected within the fashion industry, and that's probably one of the reasons why it works so well. That's why we have this very free flow exchange of ideas and creativity. There are lots of instances where, you know, like someone's culture, a community's culture is misappropriated and is basically commercialized for people to make money that are not part of that own community. So we really need to look at the idea of collective ownership. So can Indigenous communities own their patterns? And it's not just a single person, right? Because a lot of our legal structure is looking at just one single owner. And if you have, you know, multiple people or a community that's trying to claim ownership over IP, it makes it a little bit more difficult, but that's definitely something that will empower those communities whose culture has been commercialized, exploited, misappropriated. So we can have an IP conversation later. We actually will be doing one for Harvard Alumni for Fashion, Luxury, and Retail, but collective ownership is a really important concept, and empowering those people that are exploited. So, you know, we know that people work for companies, but companies should also work for people. And I'm not just talking about the end user, I'm talking about the workers as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about innovation as well, but sometimes innovation means moving backwards in order to go forwards. So we're going to hear a little bit about that from Gisele Jimenez. So I'm just going to queue up her video really quick. And I hope this comes through clear for everyone.
Hi, my name is Gisele Jimenez. I am in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. I was born and raised here in the ancestral territory of the Lenape peoples. Currently, Sunset Park is predominantly occupied by people indigenous to Mexico, parts of Central America, parts of the Caribbean, as well as parts of China. My family is from the Dominican Republic. We are Taino. The Taino are the people indigenous to many of the islands of the Caribbean, including the Dominican Republic, Haiti, which shares the island of Haiti with the Dominican Republic, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. And so all of this context information about where I'm located, where I come from, and where all the people around me and connected to me and connected to this land come from really informs the work that I'm engaged in as an artist, as an educator, and as a community organizer. My work as an artist primarily investigates and explores and affirms my personal identity as well as my shared and collective identities, mostly investigating my family's history and thinking about where we fit into the grand scheme of things. So for example, a recent series of paintings that I made dedicated to my great-grandfather are really about me seeking to reestablish this connection to my family's ancestral land, which I was not born in. And so I'm the first generation to grow in this urban context, disconnected from a rural way of living and way of seeing the world that my family has known forever into the past. And so me learning and trying to take the pieces of head knowledge that I'm learning and trying to make some sort of embodied representation of that knowledge is my way of trying to preserve and sustain and restore some of that knowledge, with the understanding that it's always going to be limited because I don't have access to the land, to farming, to swimming in the river, you know, and so my work as an educator takes a lot of that into account and is also informed by that desire to reconnect. And so my approach is really informed by a lot of the things that I learned while interning at the Museum of the American Indian. And one of these things is this notion of traditional knowledge. And so when we think about traditional knowledge, oftentimes it can have this negative connotation, even subconsciously, where we think about something that is traditional as something that's old, outdated, stuck in the past. And it can be harmful to think about Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous communities and culture in this way as people who are stuck in the past and who haven't caught up to the rest of us. But really something that's traditional is just a descriptor. It's a way of describing a system of transferring knowledge that is a type of knowledge that is passed on through generations in families, in community, and it can often not be sourced to one original person who is like has intellectual property rights over a piece of information, but instead it's knowledge that's owned by a community, which is also really important to be thinking about in the fashion industry. Like there's a lot of Indigenous nations who have begun to claim intellectual property rights collectively over certain patterns and designs, or even medicines and things like that, which is really empowering to know that they're going to be staking claim over something that they created, and it's not something that it doesn't have one owner, but it does have a collective owner. And so I hope that in my my work in academic spaces, having one foot in academia and one foot in community spaces, I hope that I can begin to take some of the knowledge that was taken from us to begin with and bring it back into communities in ways that feels relevant to us and in ways that are traditional and sustainable, because it's decentralized and it's an embodied type of knowledge. And so in my work in communities, what I've been predominantly doing along with other community organizers in Sunset is working to build up mutual aid networks, which is maybe you've heard of this concept of mutual aid. It's something that's become popular during the pandemic as we've been forced to lean on each other when the government has not really done what it should for us. But this idea is just basically the fact that, or the understanding that when we lean on each other and provide for each other, we'll never be lacking. You know, ideally, if I offer all that I have and everyone else is also offering all that they have, all my needs will be met by the people around me, and I can also help meet the needs of the people around me. And so I hope that all of these bits of nuggets of information that I'm sharing with you are useful. And thank you so much for taking the time to listen to me.
So the nuggets of information that she's referring to that I think are really useful. One is traditional knowledge, and you know, we sometimes think of that as tradition in a very negative way, especially if you consider yourself to be progressive. We see tradition as kind of like the opposite of that, but you know, maybe it's kind of just one and the same thing, or two sides of the same coin, where we need to, in order to progress, we need to hold on to traditions and honor those traditions. So we need to get away from this connotation of it being stuck in the past. And we need to have traditional knowledge. That's a kind of investment in a community that people can make, and that, you know, we can use to build human capital. So again, it's not explicitly accounted for in economies today, but knowledge and education and community knowledge and traditional knowledge are incredibly important, and mutual aid networks is another nugget that I wanted to touch on. She was saying that, basically we have sufficient resources. We have more than enough within a community, but we just have a mindset of, we have mindsets of insufficiency, of scarcity, and of competition. I think it does exist to some degree because we have 8 people in the world that have as much wealth as 4 billion people, which is kind of disgusting. But even for communities that are not like super wealthy, we should be able to have community support and mutual support. So community is really important, and brands, designers, products can all give back to those communities that they're, if you're being inspired by indigenous culture, one, like check what you're doing, but two, like make sure, like if you really believe in what you're doing, make sure that community is receiving support from your work. So we've seen mahjong sets be misappropriated, right? We've seen all, like it's not just indigenous culture or Black culture, it's, Latinos and Asians, and everyone has there are many different communities, and it's not even just like ethnic communities. You could be talking about like the queer community, or, the disabled community. There are so many, like, fashion has misappropriated, fashion has glamorized and misappropriated these things for a long time and have made money off of them. So someone's disability or someone's ethnicity is not like your design element. So there's a lot of creativity and culture and heritage that we can create. And a lot of these should be inspired by biology, which we'll touch on briefly in the next section. So just ask yourself, who is this planet for when you're creating a brand or a product, and realize that sustainability, quote unquote, and diversity are intersectional. We can't have one without another. And so this movement for regenerating communities is really, it's really closely related to environmental justice, which I implore everybody to look into. So, we have the traditional knowledge aspect that we heard about, but there are also, and kind of low-tech solutions. Here's a book that everybody can look into, Low-Tech, Designed by Radical Indigenism. As we talk about definitions, there's nothing radical about it. It's not really revolutionary. We've had these like technologies. So some of the solutions are going to be low tech, and then some of them are going to be high tech. An example of that is Prada, LVMH, and Richemont are working on blockchain. They're working on it for authentication purposes, but they should really be using it to help create transparency in their supply chain. I hope that will be kind of the next evolution. So we are going to talk a little bit about environments. So as Amy Hall mentioned, it should be additive. I actually don't know how many things we can add to the environment to make it healthier. So when we think about like being additive or net positive, usually it's removing waste from the environment. There's a very close connection between farms and fibers. So farmers' rights are really important. There's over 100,000 farmers that are protesting now in India, where COVID is super rampant because there's 3 laws where corporations are basically trying to control farms. We shouldn't be so passive with our farming system. It's something that I didn't really pay attention to before either, but a lot of our fibers, our natural fibers, come from farms. So some similarities between regenerative fashion and regenerative farming is we can try to not use chemicals. We need to analyze the material's origins. We need to look at byproducts and waste streams and try and see if those can be raw materials or inputs for other products. And we need to look at ways that we can sequester versus emit carbon. There are some, clothes and supposedly these coatings that can suck carbon out of the air, but throughout your process, if you're using natural fibers, you should be trying to use that soil and regenerating that soil for more carbon sequestering. Carbon offsets don't work. It's just a pollution tax on people that are wealthy, so they're going to continue to pollute and harm marginalized communities, specifically poor communities that can't stand up for their rights. So we're just looking at adding value to natural and vital systems. And then one other piece of good news is Caring started the Regenerative Fund for Nature. So they're converting 2.47 million acres to regenerative agriculture in 5 years, which is great. So so our next video, our last video for the day, is from Mitchell Henderson. They have a research project called Eco-Lasting, which is a spandex alternative that they're going to tell you a little bit about. Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for their first for their longer video, but I did want to point out some important things that Mitchell pointed out in their first video. So they recognize that colonization is an ongoing process. And so, regenerative systems is kind of like pushing back against that, or, kind of running the other way. Or Mitchell, similar to Amy, was talking about how we need to place exploited communities in places of leadership and empowerment. And revolutionary design is accessible and incorporates fashion, or incorporates voices across the fashion supply chain. And systems are all designed by people, and they respond to so we should design systems that respond to the needs of our communities and ecosystems rather than that of markets and of capitalism. So I'm going to play Mitchell's video that specifically talks about their research project, Eco-Lasting. And just 1 second while I cue that up.
To elaborate on some work that I have done within the scope of material science and textile development, in 2019, my team, Monica Palucci, Daniela Kohler, and I worked to create a regenerative circular solution to spandex. Spandex is derived from petroleum, and when combined with other fibers, often renders them non-recyclable. Spandex does, however, have good properties and has a wide variety of uses. We looked to nature to find ways not to get rid of spandex, but to create a solution that was regenerative and circular. We did this by discovering an elastic protein found in the adductor muscle of oysters. The muscle is typically left over after it has already been consumed, so we gathered post-consumer oysters from New York City restaurants, where we then isolated the protein from the muscle using a hot alkali method and combined it with a protein binding enzyme into a hot water bath to create a fiber-like substance. The oyster shells that we collected from the restaurants were then given to the Billion Oyster Projects, where they were given new larvae and replanted back in the New York City harbor to rebuild the local estuaries. That process can continue in the same circular cycle from the harbor to the restaurant to our lab and back into the harbor forever. More broadly, when thinking about fashion design being regenerative, I think that there are some really exciting material science prospects in addition to ours that are derived from other aquatic products, such as algae and kelp. Zero waste design and the upcycling and recycling movements have been gaining additional traction as well, which I think is really exciting. And I think overall, the consumption of clothing and materials by the global north needs to be drastically reduced, and the culture of throwaway clothing needs to be eliminated in order to have the real impacts that we are trying to see.
So, so I do want to leave enough time for Q&A. I'm sorry, Mitchell, that we couldn't get to everything, and I wanted to also thank you for doing a land acknowledgement and this research. I think it's super interesting. Nature has a lot of solutions for us. I would say whenever you can, go more towards plant products than animal products. There are a lot of animal byproducts, which are, byproducts because of our food system. So again, it's another connection between food and fashion. But if we can consider specifically plant products on something like biochar, there's fermented silks, there's mycelium leather that are really interesting. So materials is one way to be regenerative in the fashion system. You can also look at your manufacturing. Are you empowering people through it? What's your chemical use or discharge? Hopefully there's none, there shouldn't be any. And then also like how you're affecting water, land, and air. Transportation, try to not use it at all. We shouldn't be manufacturing, you know, in 3 different countries before it's sold in a 4th. It should be all, do everything as locally as you can. Think about your packaging. If you can use byproducts from that, there's a really famous newspaper in Japan where they have seeds in their paper, and then you can plant it and water it, and then it grows into flowers. So it helps, you know, it doesn't only give people knowledge, but it also improves microenvironments, or on a very small scale. But there's nothing too big or too small in this movement. Retail, you know, there's profit sharing, transparent pricing, a lot of tools that retailers have that brands don't necessarily have that they can use. Garment care is maybe a less interesting way to look at regenerative fashion, but it's also, I mean, we don't want to be regenerating or remaking things over and over and over again. We want to make them once. And we've used this linear model for a long time where we pollute once by extracting resources, and then it goes through its life cycle, and then we pollute again. So we need to end those pollution and waste streams. So disposal and waste shouldn't be a part of it. It should be circular. So just a couple of keywords. It should be holistic. We're talking about ownership and empowerment. There should also be transparency. It should be net positive. And so we're really looking at a revolution in both production and consumption. So, you know, a lot of the responsibility is on the industry, but if you're a consumer, you still have a lot of power. So we have a couple of action items. It isn't necessarily our responsibility, but it is our opportunity. And we have a regeneration as a tool to have a direct impact on the wellness of individuals, communities, environments, and economies. So educating yourself is a really important step. You all are doing that by being here today, so thank you for that. You can hold brands accountable. You can use hashtags like what's in my clothes, who made my clothes, who made my fabric, pay up, especially during the COVID pandemic. So I hope that people are moving from being passive to reactive to actually proactive. So we don't want to just react to things that are negative when they happen. We want to proactively create positive things. So with that, I'm going to open it up for Q&A. So thank you, everyone.
Timothy, I had a question that came up in a conversation happening at another event yesterday, and it was about B Corp certification and the understanding of, you know, this was a person in you know, consuming clothing, not a designer or manufacturing, asking me whether or not if they were to shop for something, if they had to buy something and they knew the material was not B Corp, but had the relationship with the vendor, and this one vendor that was on the panel was from India, and that vendor could not afford a B Corp. How do we know what is our relationship with you know, trying to figure out B Corp involvement, and whether or not having such a, you know, B Corp, you're still being asked to pay to be part of that certificate. So where is that, and how do we look at that as, you know, ethical or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, you know, we talked about this with Matteo Ward. I believe is he the head of Fashion Revolution Italy? He was saying that whenever we see certifications, we should be very wary of them. They're not something like organic. At least it's, you know, it is enforced. There's a very clear process. But what happens with a lot of certifications is it creates a lot of potentially unnecessary burdens on certain companies that they can't afford. and doesn't apply to their product, because we're trying to create these large national or multinational certifications that just don't work across the board, right? So I think Kathleen's right. There's a lot of brands or products out there that may be like B Corp or even better than B Corp, but will not have that certification. So it does, you do need to do a good amount of research. Fashion Revolution has a lot of great resources on that. But honestly, people just need to buy less, and they need to like invest in what they're buying in. So just do a little bit more research, right? And please don't only take the brand's word for it. I'm going through a job search, and somebody literally tried to tell me that Amazon has great ethics, and I just like almost lost it. Like, and they sent me, Amazon's own report, which has lots of pretty words, like no forced labor, like clean supply chains, however they want to wash it. And we know for a fact, there's no way that Amazon has 150 or 200 in-house brands and doesn't touch cotton from Xinjiang, which we all know is forced labor. Supply chains are incredibly not transparent, and it's really hard to get information. So it does create this unnecessary burden on consumers. But a brand's own communications can go a long way for a consumer to understand, but it doesn't stop there. So B Corp is one way to shop like more ethically, but I don't think it's a 100% guarantee, and it's definitely not the only certification that matters.
That kind of leads into Reagan. Did you want to come on board and talk about your question? I wonder if Timothy answered it.
Yeah, I think you just touched on my question, but I am very concerned about greenwashing in the fashion industry, especially as green is in, and you see fast fashion brands that we know are not doing anything good for the planet or for the people that produce those clothes, but people are getting very manipulated by the green packaging or maybe some of the greenwashing terms. And I was just curious as to those of us on the call, what tools we have at our fingertips to help educate consumers to see through that greenwashing, and then just ultimately how brands are going to be held accountable, like how you see that happening, whether that's legally or using these sorts of third-party certifications. But it's just genuinely very frustrating to see brands like H&M get up and say, have a very like well done campaign about their green clothing, and then it's just completely baseless. So just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so we have 3 tools that we can use. We can use supply, demand, or policy to attack these issues. So supply is obviously like if you're working within the fashion industry, you're part of that, right? Demand is a consumer or a citizen. I think as Fashion Revolution kind of labels people more accurately, we don't want to deduce people and just say you're only a consumer, right? And then the third one is policy. That one's a little bit more complicated, but if we're battling something like microplastics, like we can enact, like if we just get all manufacturers of washers and dryers to install, these filters, that will have a huge impact, right? So the problem with a lot of like the marketing and campaigns is that a lot of it is relative, right? So if you use a word like sustainable, if you would use a word like green, I think that they're just talking about like a slightly better product. And, Hassan Minhaj did something about H&M in particular and like their green collection. I don't even know what it's called. I really don't care because it's not. They literally use like 2 or 3% of virgin wool, in a polyester blend. So they were saying that it's more sustainable when really you just wasted that 3% of wool fibers in that because we can't separate fibers, right? So for consumers consumer education is extremely important. Companies are not all B Corps, and they're not going to respond to like moral imperatives, they respond to their bottom line. So that's definitely, one way to not attack them, but to make our voices be heard. So it's consumer activism, it's buying, if you find like a really great brand that resonates with you, purchase directly from them, don't purchase through Amazon. Just try and get as much money as you can directly to like those people that are actually making your clothes, that are actually making your materials, that are farming them. I know that that's a little bit easier said than done, but thank you so much for that question. I hope I
Can I add to
answered
that,
it.
Timothy, a little bit?
Yeah.
Just about the policy, because Fashion Revolution, we had our policy panel last evening, and it will be updated on our page. But the concern is right now, the Garment Workers Center is creating a Protection Act. And if this Protection Act goes through in California, this leads the way for legislation to be in all of our states to protect our garment workers. And that's one of the biggest policies that we need. There's also the article that was written by Elizabeth Segrin about does fashion, to ask the Biden administration to appoint a fashion czar. And the idea behind that is to have somebody in the White House that is looking over all of these components that we've talked about today and more, and to have that voice in the White House and building the concern between legislation, between our state and city connections and all of those pieces. So there is for the Garment Workers Center, the next stage of the bill pass is coming up, I think on May 19th. And you'll see on Fashion Revolution, we'll have a whole write-up template where everybody can get involved and write to the California government, if you will, to pass this big initiative for building more protection for our garment workers.
And to touch briefly on packaging from your question, a lot of the packaging, and also to address Kelly's question about just losing the definition of sustainability, a lot of packaging is like, I got bananas and they were like wrapped in this, they're wrapped in plastic on the top, and then they're covered in a band that just says like organic. And I'm like, I really like, if you like, you have such a beautiful product that comes from nature, right? And we have so many great things that come from nature, and we try to like package them, and and that's just greenwashing, right? Organic, of course, is a certification that people care about, but I think I saw in Preksha's question, can SDGs be a pathway for fashion brands to be regenerative? So the SDGs are great, pretty much because of the intersectional nature of fashion. It really does touch on most of those SDGs. If you're employing a lot of those SDGs, then you can get close to a regenerative model. I don't think that it'll necessarily be regenerative. Not everything has to be regenerative. So to Kelly's point, we definitely don't want to use the term sustainable. We don't want to use the term green. We can use things that are very specific, like circular. Is this product circular? Is it regenerative? Is it zero waste? Even if it's like zero waste, it's like one step, but it's a very clear thing, right? Like in the production of this product, like, in pattern, when you're making patterns or whatever, there's a lot of waste of materials that we can't use. Materials used to be super expensive because they are really valuable, right? We've just made them really cheap through, automating a lot of those processes. So another question, or let's go to Bailey. I feel like we need to re-educate the consumer on what is actually affordable. This is a great point. Fashion hasn't inflated in years except luxury. Our perception on what is affordable is based on enslaved people not being paid to make this affordable fashion. Yes, so citizen re-education is key, and that's what we're doing here. To Reagan's point, we want to make it simple so that people can understand it. People aren't going to take a lot of time to go and research the intricacies of it. But one of the most encouraging things that I realized is that behavioral change can happen in an instant. You tell a person one thing and that thing sticks with them or resonates with them, and they make an entire lifestyle change. So sometimes, we don't need to bombard people with a lot of information, but we need to make stuff make sense. If you tell people that, I don't even know the number because it doesn't mean anything. If you tell them, I think it's 5,000 liters of water to make a pair of jeans, that doesn't mean anything to anyone, but if you tell them it's 10 years of drinking water, then that means something, right? Like it applies to you, right? So I think it's just how we appropriate our income, like how are we spending our money? And again, investing in fewer pieces and paying a little bit more for them, something that's going to last forever. This top will last me for forever. I'll pass it down to my children if I had children and their children, you know, and it'll become something like an heirloom. We should look at investing in our clothes and clothing as you know, especially for millennials and Gen Z who can't afford, you know, houses and cars, we can afford, you know, at least nice clothes. And some of these do retain their value, specifically jewelry and handbags. But again, consider everything from a holistic sort of perspective. So I'm more than happy to stick on for a few minutes and answer questions from people. If anybody needed to go and have one of their question answered, you can like raise your hand or notify Kathleen. So Regan said, it seems that a lot of sustainable options can be cost prohibitive. That's also very true. So when we look at these, if you're really trying to create a regenerative brand, I'd really urge you to be super transparent about your pricing. And this is something that, like, you know, like we know that there's a 3.5 times landed retail for most products, right? And that's including the markup that the designer already gets from wholesale. So there's a lot of there's a lack of transparency in the pricing system as well. So if we as consumers knew this much went to the material, this much, you know, went to labor, this much went to transportation, this much went to marketing, like, I think that would just allow us to make much better decisions. Of course, you know, if you're not a brand acting in the best interest of everyone along the value chain, then you don't want to be that transparent. But if you're a regenerative brand, I think you should kind of lay out that information, and so that people understand like why they're spending that much money on a certain product, but they also don't have to be that expensive. So Young said people who are more skeptical or maybe a little hopeless seem to be wondering how realistic implementing regenerative or circular systems actually is. I wonder the same thing, only because I truly hope to see such transformations, but I'm aware of the strong resistance to change we see all over the globe. There will need to be a collaborative effort between governments and business sectors and communities, of course, but do you have any thoughts on this? Don't we need mass implementation to have the impact we want to have? How do we sell this to skeptics? So this is a great question. So do we need mass implementation? We do, but again, no action is too big or too small for this. All actions, like honestly, even if you're impacting one person or 3 people or like a community of 10 people, it can be a model, right? We're really in a proof of concept stage, right? And we do need coordinated efforts. Hopefully, as Kathleen was mentioning, we'll see something from the US government. France has done a good amount, I think, with trying to create policies around the fashion industry. But please don't be pessimistic about any of this. This is it's a daunting task, but we should be extremely energized by being the generations that are able to make this huge paradigm shift in the fashion industry. It's not your responsibility necessarily, but it's your opportunity. So please don't be discouraged. So I don't, so I'm gonna answer a couple more questions. Bailey, if you watch Black Fiber Systems lecture free on YouTube, you'll see how deeply ingrained. Okay, thank you for sharing that. If there are any resources, please feel free to share in the chat. So average consumer can't afford reformation and may discount themselves from being a participant in the sustainable fashion movement. Thrifting is a great option. Yeah, fast fashion, It's definitely hard to, I think, resist those things, but we have to understand that they're designed to be that way. Like they're designed to like literally manipulate you into supporting something that I think no person here would support. Like if you saw the people that were making your clothes, if you saw their face, like, and you had a soul, I mean, I don't think you'd really be doing it, but they're designed to manipulate you. So I've seen statistics that it's actually the upper middle class that spend the most on fast fashion. That's super interesting. And there's a lot of people who will tell you, like financial experts who say that like you can't spend money on clothes and still build wealth. I think that's a total falsehood. It's very expensive. It's actually more expensive to constantly replace your wardrobe. And I'm just talking about like the finances of it. But then there's also the human cost and the environmental cost. So if you want to potentially, you know, have something that's actually worth something, like the stuff in my closet is actually worth something, then you need to like invest a little bit in it, and you're going to help a lot of people generally along the supply chain. Not all expensive brands are fairly sharing their profits with people along the value chain. As we know, the margins are huge. So yeah, I think that looks like most of the questions. If I missed anyone's question, you can take yourself off of mute. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today. Happy Earth Day. Happy, I don't know if you guys say happy Fashion Revolution Week. To me, it's like it's a very sad thing, obviously, that sparked this revolution, but it's a very positive thing that it's happening. So Kathleen, did you have anything to wrap up?
No, just to say thank you so much, Timothy, for this conversation. And I think it's a conversation of topics that we haven't, you know, dove this deep into. So I so much appreciate your expertise and what you're bringing to our classroom here, and just coming up with the whole idea surrounding this presentation and the sharing. And thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you here today. Fashion Revolution is very honored to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I wanted to say thank you to Kelly Peaks and Mackenzie Mock and Gabby Vasquez, as well as our presenters, Mitchell Henderson, Amy Hall, and Gisele Jimenez. So it definitely takes a village. So thank you, everyone.